and I'm honored to speak with you about the work of our practice. So, as Milton mentioned, I work in collaboration with my partner in all things, Tom Carruthers, and we've been working together actually for, I think, only 6 years together. And I think, the fact that we're working in partnership and in collaboration, and that we're two distinct individuals who have our own motivations that somehow have to kind of find their way through these collaborative projects, I think is a really important thing to mention about our practice. We often describe our work as these kind of prepositional phrases. I would say like bits of text and meaning that are about the spaces in between. About linkages, systems, things outside of our awareness. We're really interested in blind spots and slippages, and you'll see this kind of perceptual uncertainty kind of repeating in the work that I show this evening. And we're interested in the way that our work can challenge the imagination, complicate our known understanding of things, from architecture to the building blocks of infrastructure to these other systems that we might hold for granted. We're concerned with edges, boundaries, placement, and the ways in which architecture seen through a metaphorical lens can open up multiple interpretations and perspectives. We often work in public space. We're pretty committed to working in the messiness of public space. Often these spaces are kind of marginal or kind of outside of, with the exception of PS1, which was very central, outside of the kind of typical flow of things. We're concerned with the figure and its ground, but not in a kind of binary way or as a gradient between oppositions, but instead in how these terms can get interwoven and enmeshed with one another. So how a flat surface can imply a kind of depth, or how architecture and its fixity and concreteness can open up arenas for flexibility and chance. We've worked in prairie landscapes, a place whose lot lines are set by an unrelenting patterning of the Jeffersonian grid and trying to subvert that in certain ways. And we've worked in urban landscapes, kind of reordering context to reveal other narratives. Our work often has precarity kind of inherent in its form. Often we're interested in setting up these dynamics in space that depend on audience engagement, their movements, their interactions, their sense of curiosity and propensity for risk. And we intentionally, even though we make things, and we're very careful to call them things and not objects, because we consider ourselves to have a sort of non-objective practice where each of our works is really about these relationships that it sets into motion. Often they're about kind of showing the world to itself. So this is a piece that has a series of video projections and live feed video projections that are kind of displayed on these opposing screens. That creates a kind of spatial jump cut when you view this on the other axis. I think it's important to say that we are workers and makers. Here I am probably wearing every known pattern in the universe. We're committed to making physical things. And I think that this oscillation between kind of thinking and things, this oscillation between thinking and deliberating about what we make and then actually making it and kind of learning from that process, is an essential part of kind of how we work. So this evening I'm going to show you 3 projects that are kind of a little bit of a journey. So I'll show these 3 projects more in depth, and hopefully you'll come away with a sense of what motivates us as architects and artists. So this first project is called Longing, and the title is both an emotional expression and a kind of verbal play on lengthening, which will kind of make sense as I describe the project. So the site for this installation was actually an abandoned Skyway pedestrian bridge. So this is the only one of this kind of 8-mile long network that connects the second stories of all the buildings in downtown Minneapolis. This is the only one that was actually removed from that network and preserved. So a couple of enterprising architects actually bought this thing when it was removed from that site in red there to make way for the dashed line of the light rail. And they, bought it with the hope that they could eventually use it at, kind of reuse this fragment of 1970s brutalism as a, upstate cabin somewhere. But in the interim, they had to figure out what to do with this thing, so it moved here, which is a kind of, odd site on the fringes of a lot of different, it was sort of a space in between a lot of different types of systems. So you have the kind of university campus to the left of the image, some silos to the right, and then a transcontinental railway to the north of the site. But most importantly, it was on city-owned property, which became a kind of way in which we could actually do this intervention in this place. So we were really interested in this kind of fragment of this other network, sort of like a memory of another system, especially in the Twin Cities. Like, anybody who sees this image knows immediately what this is. They recognize it as a pedestrian bridge. And so we were really interested in how we take this kind of fragment and reconnect it to a new network, kind of like reestablishing this patterning that maybe already, that previously existed when it was part of the Skyway system. So when we found it, it was in this really derelict condition. It had sat on that site for about 9 years while these architects tried to get a client who would be willing to work with this particular structure. And so the end walls were, some boarded up plywood and a roll down door. And we decided that we wanted to remove those and replace them with these mirrors that were both, inward facing. Oh, technical difficulty. Let's see if that'll come back. Okay. These inward facing mirrors. And so obviously when you have mirrors that face one another, in the reflection you get this kind of infinite line that goes off into the distance. And so we were really interested if this is a kind of like original state of this infrastructure. We were really interested in kind of like replicating it out of its own singular instance. So how do we make a multiple out of a singular object? And the sort of illusory effects that we were interested in aren't necessarily new, right? So here in San Sotiro by Bramante, you have a kind of collapse of architectural and perspectival space. Let me see if I can use a cursor here. I don't have a laser. Oh, there we go. So here the painting and the architecture together complete the kind of cruciform plan of the church, right? Like, so there's no actual nave here. So through the kind of crinkling of these pilasters and this sort of trompe-l'oeil painted on architecture, you get this sense of space in a kind of two-dimensional, or at least much more flat surface. But the thing that we were really excited by was like this crinkling here of the pilaster, because instead of having a kind of singular vanishing point from which this illusion works, now you start to get a kind of cloud-like field of vanishing points. So because of the crinkling of the pilaster and the kind of implication of architecture in the illusion, this creation of the nave starts to work in parallax. So it kind of blurs this privileged singular position. So we were really interested in, what happens if we take those end walls, take the kind of the plane of the illusion and start to make it move. So, take the static thing and start to flex it and torque it and turn it in various ways. And so instead of having this kind of, fixed singular vanishing point, you start to get this kind of wandering sense of a line. And we were interested in how this might start to create other kinds of forms, right? That we can kind of imagine the line when the mirrors are parallel, but what happens is they start to cant and move. You might start to get a torus or a Klein bottle or a Mobius strip or some other kind of impossible shape. some of the like lurching, kind of yearning quality of the title of this piece. So this because these mirrors are both moving at kind of their own volition, they were easily pushed by just kind of pressing on the mirror, or as you saw in the earlier video from the kind of prairie winds that surrounded it. The kind of space that's created within the illusory depth of the mirror has this kind of searching and yearning quality. So this was all supported by this tensegrity structure that was at the rear of the mirrors. Is there a way to turn the lights down? Because I feel like this is getting really washed out. I don't know how to do that. Oh, much better. It's like now I can see. So the area behind the plane of the mirror the mirrors were supported by this tensegrity structure that connected to the existing framework of the skyway. And so there was a really small kind of like 1/2 inch gap around the plane of the mirror relative to the structure. So we were really trying to fill the kind of entirety of that end wall. And each one of these planes is 10 feet by 15 feet wide. And so this tensegrity structure in the back is actually inset one bay in the skyway, and so it also kind of compresses the sense of space in between the two mirrors there. So that kind of long bar that you see coming out here was actually the counterweight for the mirror, and so this is a hollow pipe, and then we kind of inserted this solid steel slug, and that's the way that we were able to balance the mirrors so that they were completely vertical. Here's another view of that from the back. And here you can see like the two mirrors kind of inset in the bay. There is a short film that we made in collaboration with another artist, this filmmaker Isaac Gale. We're very much interested in kind of distributed authorship and finding other ways to kind of unearth what's happening with the project. And so we made this film with him that in some ways it kind of moves beyond just documentation of the project, but really starts to talk a little bit more about the kind of mood that was set in this place. So I'm going to play that here. And all the sounds from this film were actually kind of distortions of sounds that the piece itself would make. It's a little dark, literally and figuratively. But, so as Melton mentioned in the introduction, we were winners of the Young Architects Program in 2018. And honestly, we were just really honored to be even nominated for this competition. So basically the museum, it's an invited competition where about 50 firms are asked to submit a portfolio and kind of an early sketch proposal of what they might do in the space. And even to be in that group of 50, we were kind of like, oh, wow, I thought we were just sort of out here in the Midwest, like making these sort of strange things. But then we sort of entered into this whole, process of developing an argument for the competition proposal that was eventually presented to kind of all the powers that be at the museum. So Glenn Lowry, Klaus Biesenbach, who was then the head of MoMA PS1 before he came to LA. And so some of the images that I'll show here are from that kind of early competition proposal, and then we'll kind of lead into sort of final images of the project. But we really started with something that we thought that the jury would understand, which was an artwork. So we started with things that are important to us, which is people in public space. And so we started our presentation with this discussion of a piece called Art Is by the artist Lorraine O'Grady. And this was a performance art piece that she did at the Afro-American Day Parade in Harlem in 1983. Where she went to this parade with a number of, I think about 15 dancers who were all wearing white and carrying these gilt frames as they moved through the crowd. And as they carried these gilt frames, people would yell out, frame us, we're the art, frame us, we're the art. And so there became this really interesting kind of complication of who the audience is, who's the performer. A kind of reconfiguring of really who's allowed within this kind of art historical frame. And in this series of photographs that O'Grady produced, we were really compelled by the ways in which sort of people exerted their own agency within these pictures and found these various ways of kind of transgressing the framing devices of these images. So you have the kind of compositional frame of the photograph itself, then the frame, the gilt frame, sort of like, if you will, kind of representing this kind of art historical boundary. But also then there's a prevalence of the kind of policed edge, sort of separating these various realms of public space. So we became, we were really fascinated by this project as a kind of provocation to the museum and its context. And so then this quote became a real guiding light for us in the course of the project. And this trick, of course, is this refusal of border under the constraint of border's constant imposition, right? Acknowledging that there are these kind of like limitations that exist, but how do we start to refute these edges? And so this is the context that we were presented with. This is the reality of the courtyard at MoMA PS1. So we were really interested in starting to kind of insert a project that acted as a refusal to this condition. So there are these 15-foot high concrete walls that really separate this space from the surrounding community. And also the geometry of this courtyard is super awkward. It sort of reminded us of Gordon Matta Clark's Fake Estates project, which is a series of kind of basically irregularities in the street grid that he started going around, actually not too far from this site in Long Island City, these various locations in Queens, and slowly buying up these little slivers of property that were left over from these kind of grid intersections in the urban fabric. So he might buy a lot that was 2 feet wide by 200 feet long. And so similarly, the courtyard at PS1 is this kind of like leftover space. I think this was also a way for us to kind of like deprivilege the space of the museum so that we could actually feel like we could do something in this place. So this is the sort of boundary of the site that we were given. And, operating off of these kind of other misalignments, we were interested in inserting a kind of parasite within that space that didn't necessarily have any kind of alignment to the existing systems that were around it, but it acted as a kind of another network sort of superimposed on top of it. And we kind of learned from the longing project that I showed previously, and hide and seek then became a kind of instance of longing in mass parallel. The timeline for this competition is really short. We were asked to, I think, submit our initial qualifications in October, and then we gave our final presentation in January and found out that we had won in March or late February, and then the project had to be up and running by the end of June. So there was a certain strategy of trying to work out of our own work, especially because of this compressed timeline. And so we, kind of created these early images showing the ways in which this kind of intersecting network would start to operate in this space, these kind of flexing infinite voids that are created by these mirrors. And we produced a really elaborate model to try and give the jury some sort of semblance of what we were proposing. And what we were really interested in was this kind of like two-tiered system. So the lower network has these kind of flexing mirrored spaces, and then the upper registers are these big trusses that act as periscopes that can connect certain points on the interior to spaces outside of the street. It was important for us to kind of demonstrate to them the ways in which we were kind of skewering the institution. And so we used a Grasshopper script and baked a series of 3D models out of this Rhino script. And so we showed these little urchins, which are all different iterations of those kind of flexing mirrored environments, kind of projected out through the space, through the walls of the museum. And I think another thing that became really important to us in the competition phase was also highlighting that this whole project is really working in service of the people who are coming to experience it. And so this is one of my students, Emmy Tong, and her task with this model was to 3D print and hand paint all of the scale figures that went into this model. And the reason why we did that was because usually most scale figures that you buy, all kind of look like this and they're wearing suits. And so for us, it was really important to show the variety and life and diversity of people who would be coming to this place. And also all of those figures weren't glued down. And so every time we kind of moved the model, it was also this sort of exercise in testing our own understanding of how people might navigate this place. So, how do we position 3 people so it looks like they're having a conversation or dancing at a party or something like that. And so we won, which was maybe a blessing and a curse, but we won. But then there was this kind of, the reality of actually making this thing real, and really maybe stepping across another kind of border at our own risk. And so the way that we worked on the project, and the way that we work actually on all of our projects, is with a kind of highly coordinated Rhino model. And, things were fabricated directly from this model. But also because of this super accelerated timeline, there was a lot of hand sketching too, and sort of a back and forth between us and the engineer and lighting designer, in a really probably much more fluid way than is kind of normally practiced. But, a lot of sort of hand-drawn details and honestly, late night discussions about what's appropriate to do here. The piece was fabricated in Minnesota and then kind of shipped to New York and fabricated on site. And I think, it became important to us to think about not only who is making this work, but who's designing the work, but who's fabricating it as well. And so we really worked hard to kind of hire women and people of color as fabricators, who started to have this really interesting kind of learning with some of the older millwrights who are working on the project. And Maddie, who has her mask down with the blonde hair, these were two women who were like direct graduates from trade school. And after our project, Maddie was hired by the millwrights, which was like a really kind of great thing, that there was this sort of feedback loop of learning that was happening. But as I said, so we brought pieces to New York, and then there was a process of actually getting this thing up and installed. And so this is a little time lapse of putting the main truss in over the main courtyard. This was like a super exciting moment once those red tape marks are our survey marks that we made in the courtyard. So there was like this moment of, are we going to hit the survey marks? Like, are we actually, measure twice and cut once kind of thing? So there was this kind of, it was a really crazy project because we're operating with a certain level of precision, but also at this kind of like gargantuan scale to make something that had a sort of like presence and impact in that 18,000 square foot space. There was a large runway that we kind of constructed there, hanging canopy fabric, putting in lights, putting in a hammock, doing these kind of graphite wall murals. Here are a couple of Yale graduate students. We called them the little ducks or like worker bees, making these graphite drawings. And then this was the kind of finished installation. So you can see that there are these series of kind of like long lines almost that are drawn across the space. So the canopy in one area kind of continues all the way through the project. So in plan, kind of like one idea per slide, one idea per space in the context of this installation. So the kind of main courtyard had this big, long runway, which really changed in terms of its usage over the course of the day and the week. So, on the weekday, people would sit here and maybe have lunch and kind of smaller, intimate conversations, or just kind of take a break from the heat of the summer. But then on Saturdays, when they would have this big warm-up party with live music, the performers were over at the stage at the top of the stairs here. This became a kind of like fashion parade, a kind of performance stage for people to sort of dance here and have the surrounding audience around them watch them. This was another like little secondary stage for smaller events. There's a tiny little seat in this baby courtyard. And probably my favorite part of the project was this big hammock. This is 18 by 27 feet in the small courtyard that provided a kind of sense of sanctuary. And so the program that we were given is to have seating, shading, and water, and we kind of arrayed those sectionally. So seating, shade canopy, and then the water was kind of distributed to the site through these upper trusses, through this misting system. And this is a view of that same kind of view of the wall with that aperture into the small courtyard, but with our installation installed there. And here's that hammock space. So there really became a kind of ambiguity of like where the edges of this courtyard start and stop, and finding ways to sort of pierce through, at least imagistically, like pierce through the kind of walls of the courtyard. So ways in which the space was kind of replicated or had these sort of ambiguous layers to it. This is that upper truss over the main courtyard. And as I mentioned before, that space actually was a way for us to kind of connect various points on the interior to the street outside. And so the truss that was over the kind of bookstore here, when you would look up into one mirror, it would bounce here, and then you'd have a view down into the hammock space. And then similarly, from this runway, you could kind of look up into the mirror here, it would bounce over here, and then you'd connect back out to the street. So there's a view of a little guy walking along the street edge there. So again, it was also kind of complicating the fact that, like, what if you don't have $25 to go to warm up? How can you still kind of participate in the life of what's happening on the interior of the courtyard? And I think also the way in which the trusses started to transmit light through this kind of misting system was another way that this piece kind of reached beyond the boundaries of the courtyard itself. So here's an image of, maybe this is like my Minnesota roots coming through, so a little bit of Purple Rain, like Prince reference. But we were really interested in like how the misting system could act as a kind of like literal watercolor and start to like kind of shade and introduce this other color palette into the space. And the mist also during the day acted as a kind of a way of introducing a certain level of noise into the scene, like visual noise. And so it became a kind of static that like pulsated on and off at this like sort of irregular pattern as a way to kind of reset the visual field to a certain extent. And so here you can kind of see a little bit of that graphite mural in the combination with the mist also. So basically any point where one of those lines or bars would intersect with a wall, we registered that moment with a large kind of graphite drawing on the inner and outer face of the museum. So if you go to PS1, you'll probably still see those there. The rain hasn't washed all of them off yet. But through this kind of multiplication of mirrors, there was a kind of glitchiness that was introduced into this space, a certain like reordering of bodies, privileged views into other spots, ways in which mirrors would start to make it look like walls were kind of peeling out and becoming a single plane, or areas where the kind of thinness of this like three-dimensional drawing would oscillate between being volumetric and being very flat. Well, here's another instance of that graphite mural. But these are like the kind of, like typical architect photographs of the piece that like don't have any people in them. But, I think where the piece really started to come alive was when people were actually occupying it. So it both had to work at the scale of 1 to 15 people who might be in the courtyard on a Tuesday afternoon, but also work at the scale of 5,000. And so it really took on this other kind of life when you saw the crowd kind of multiplied in these reflections. And this central runway space really became a platform for all other, another set of performances, right? So this was a double Dutch troupe who did this great performance in one of their evening events. I think they booked a double Dutch crew because it was like hide and seek, double Dutch, kind of playing off of the name of these like childhood games. So this is what the courtyard looks like every Saturday. This is not actually at capacity, but during warm-up, there's about 5,000 people that come to this space every Saturday while the installation is up. And so, not only were we thinking about like how does the piece change when people are, when there's many more people who are occupying it, but safety became like a really big concern in terms of like dealing with 5,000 drunk people and how they might do things that are somewhat irrational in public space. So this is a short little video that kind of tells you a little bit more about the experience of the piece. Now, the last project that I'm going to show is currently on view at Mad Art Studio in Seattle, Washington. And I titled this talk Blind Spots not only because it sounds better than scotoma or some kind of medical term, but also that the title acknowledges that I'm kind of still parsing through sort of aspects of my own work. And a blind spot is an obscuration of the visual field that's caused by an area where the optic nerve enters the retina. Now, we know that vision is both projective and receptive, with the mind making sense of light and information that's presented to the eye. So there are things that I can't yet recognize or know about my own work. I think architecture is a practice, and so we're continually in the work of wading through our evolving interests and learning from the things that we've made. I think Tom and I consider all of our projects to be sketches, kind of like quick drawings that test an idea, even though they're operating at a really at a large scale. So if other architects are maybe making novels and tall buildings, perhaps these installations are more like short stories. So I think there's a kind of tenderness and vulnerability to this effort, which is something that as students you probably all know a little bit about. So this most recent project opened on October 17th, which is less than a month ago. So obviously, while we have a set of intuitions that grew into motivations that solidified into design details and specifications, there's still a lot that I'm learning from this. The title of the piece is Lure, and so one question we still wrestle with is like whether the work is a trap or an escape from one. I'm learning more about passages, and this is something that has been prevalent in our work, and we can talk about Walter Benjamin and arcades and the flaneur, about Lefebvre and movements between public and private realms, loops, feedbacks, circuits. I'm always learning more about walking in every project that we do and what captures our attention. I'll show a couple images later of people just turning their heads, and I think that moment of actually turning your head and acknowledging something else and bringing something into your awareness is a really intriguing point for me. Let's see. I'm learning about being submerged in water. I'm learning about blue. With this piece, I'm remembering a visit to Blue Black, which is an exhibition at the Pulitzer Foundation in 2017 in St. Louis, where there were over 60 works by artists exploring the colors blue, black, and their associations. And so I could kind of go on in terms of things that I'm thinking about in the context of this work that maybe I had kind of tentative ideas about, but now that I actually see the thing and can start to respond to how it actually performs and how people move through it and what the materials actually look like in their final configuration. There's a lot that I'm still kind of figuring out about this one. So pardon me if the presentation of this work still seems a little wandering, because I'm still kind of trying to place these various associations. So this project, we've thought about it as an image that you can actually walk into. Whereas a lot of our earlier work has mirrors or a kind of two-dimensional surface that maybe implies a certain depth. Here, we were interested in kind of occupying the space of those sort of infinite loops that were in the Longing Project and in Hide and Seek. So this is the gallery. It's Mad Art Studio. It's in South Lake Union, which is a part of Seattle that's probably best known for being the corporate headquarters of Amazon. And most of the time, the gallery just looks like a blank wall. I mean, it's glass, so technically you can see in, but because it's so reflective, it really is more about, it becomes this kind of flat plane that just sort of reflects the life of the street, but doesn't really necessarily invite you into the space. And then from the interior, you get this really almost like filmic kind of snippet of the life of the street sort of presented with such clarity to you from the inside. So you can see people kind of walking back and forth in front of these doors. And so what was interesting to us were kind of the multiple thresholds that existed within this space, these kind of boundary conditions that slowly were revealed to you as you moved through the gallery from the three big sliding glass doors underneath this kind of mezzanine space, and then to these skylights in the back that had this really beautiful wash of like blue light. So the early sketches of the piece became about connecting these different threshold conditions. So how do we move from the space of the street to these skylights in the back? And we were inspired, I think, to a certain extent by Teatro Olimpico in the Veneto in Italy. I love this drawing because it kind of looks like a section, elevation, and perspective, like all in one. So we were really interested in how this kind of scenographic depth is a way of inserting public space into the interior environment of the theater. So this is a kind of plan view, and you have let me see. Where's my cursor here? The kind of scenic backdrop, and then Scamozzi's like incredible kind of collapse, like compressed perspectival street scenes in these kind of deep corridor spaces. So then there's this kind of overlap of the street elevation operating as the kind of scene franz that's like the backdrop in a Roman theater. And then our project became about kind of these looping passages that would take you from the space of the street into the gallery, but you were in the gallery, but still sort of in the public realm of the street because you're kind of walking on the lined paths of this blue debris netting. And so we were kind of making these kind of infinite loops through this space. And each of these kind of corridors also sort of corresponded to certain points outside on the streetscape, so the trolley stop, the bus stop, and the crosswalk. So the exterior facade, we actually cladded in this debris netting that's like used for construction projects, which is actually very hard to find in Seattle because there's so much construction going on. So it took us a really long time to like actually get blue debris netting, oddly enough. But the proportion of this kind of scrim is actually a cinemascope image, so a kind of widescreen image, again, kind of toying with these sort of film references, which is fun to talk about in LA. But so we were interested in how do you kind of fold the space of the street into the interior of the gallery. So you're sort of walking on this exterior surface when you move into it. And, the gallery itself has this sort of mission of making art making visible to the public. So they host artists for a 3 to 4 week residency period where you're actually fabricating the work in the space. And, if it's not too dangerous, people in the public can like kind of walk in and ask you questions about your work and see the artwork actually coming to fruition. And so we kind of ran with that as part of, some of the motivations for this work is, how do you make that kind of generous invitation to someone to enter into a space? How do you capture someone's attention and get them to turn their head and break from their typical routine and cross into another space and commit themselves to something that maybe they haven't experienced before. So we're really interested in that kind of like provocation of curiosity. So here are some interior shots. Work. And so this blue starts to become a kind of veil that you can step in and out of. And there's lots of associations with blue. Stop error, faulty memory. Blue as a filter, as a ghosting device, as a veil. This kind of parasitic blue wave moving through the space. I think another thing that was really important to us is how blue screens imply a kind of not only like a pixelization of the surface, a pixelization of the image, but also the way in which these kind of blue veils are used in film post-production. So you've heard of the green screen. They also use blue screens in something that's called chroma key composting, which is a way of basically superimposing two spaces two times on top of one another, right? So I think this kind of builds off of some of our earlier fascinations with these kind of spatial jump cuts. And so I think that the blue in that way ties into that kind of understanding of it as this almost this way of erasing the space of the gallery, making the gallery another blind spot within this urban fabric, is a kind of place out of time or a place out of space. When you see this construction netting, often it implies a space that's in transition, as though like, okay, don't look at that because it's, something's coming, but it's not there yet. So I think that was something that was really important to us. And in future exhibitions of this work, like obviously this piece is very site specific to this gallery, but we hope to exhibit the kind of blue carapace, this like blue fabric, someplace else as a kind of non-site, again, sort of emphasizing this overlay of one space onto another. So here are people kind of experiencing that moment of going up to the skylight. Here's that back corner. Again, I think in this project and also in the sort of hide and seek project, there's this kind of structural ambiguity. So there's this double cantilever here that just kind of seems to be hovering out in the middle of space. And I'll end with this, a few more images of the project. Thanks. Yeah, questions?
There's a freshman here who has a question. They go first.
Students with questions, always good.
Okay.
Okay.
Is there a film of this project? Have you done a film?
Well, that looping one at the beginning is all the footage that we have so far. But I'll just say yes. If something is coming.
Well, I think that, for me, maybe for the film of the first project was really quite compelling. I think clearly there's a filmic way of producing your work.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see that factoring into future work that gets, as the work gets larger, as the work gets more complicated, as the work perhaps gets more built, larger buildings and things? How do you see
Hopefully more permanent too, since all of these are temporary projects.
the filmic way of producing the work continuing as the scale and the complexity of your furnished work is
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way, the films serve as like another iteration of the project, and we definitely, it's almost like we're interested in the way in which and I think it's also because we make these very temporary things, right? Like this will be up until December 7th. That your understanding of the work becomes fragmented through all of these different types of media, through the drawing, through the photographs, through the film, through your direct experience of it if you're actually able to go there, which then, once the piece comes down, it's only a memory, right? So there's a way in which the project is kind of like continually authored by the people who come to it or the people who see these images and have some kind of response to it. And so in that way, I do think that the films are really important, and they become another artifact of the work. You know, it's funny. One of our mentors told us that we should keep making films. That was like his one sentence of advice to us. He's like, you need to make some films, and we were like, okay, I don't know really where that's going, but so I think it's something that certainly it's a kind of language that we're working with, right? Like the splice, the jump cut, and we're trying to kind of make these seemingly almost like digital interfaces like appear in analog form. So whether or not that becomes like more layered and complex as we keep going, I think it's something we're thinking about. Yeah. Two.
First question is, obviously the word right now is operating as art. There's this sort of set of techniques that come from our world in terms of embedded meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also a sort of very architectural side of it, which is about the kind of spatial experience,
Mm-hmm.
the issues of like kind of conduits and passages and apertures and punctures and openings and things like that. But there's also, which is all the things that we talked about, but I guess the part we haven't talked about that I'm really curious about is let's say issues of structural expression, which is
Mm-hmm.
something that seems quite consistent in the work,
Mm-hmm.
and what structural expression means to you and how you guys leverage that as an opportunity. The second part is a little bit off of a built-in question, which is if the goal is to scale up
I didn't say that was the goal. That's what he said. Do I have to? Oh, well, okay. It's interesting because especially when we were doing press stuff for PS1, that was like always the journalist question of well, clearly you want to be, eventually scaling up and making, 50-story towers somewhere. And I actually think that this is a really productive space for us right now. I'm not saying that we would never do a larger, permanent, more traditional architectural project, but I think that there's something that's worth exploring, and we're interested in exploring it at this scale. So I don't necessarily think there's an immediate aspiration to all of a sudden kind of like man up and get really bigger, a lot bigger. What was the first? Oh, the first question was about structure. So we work with, as Milton mentioned in the introduction, we work pretty closely with a particular structural engineer, this guy Clayton Binkley, who for a long time was at Arup in their Seattle office. And we've known Clayton for a really long time. I've actually known Clayton longer than I've known Tom. He was 2 years ahead of me in college, and then he and Tom are best friends from high school. So it just so happens that now we're able to kind of like work together in this professional capacity. So this piece was actually the first time that Clayton, Tom, and I kind of all worked together in close collaboration from the like early conceptual phases of the project. I think in most of our other projects, it was kind of Tom and I sort of setting a direction, and then Clayton was really acting as a kind of structural engineer to help facilitate the execution. And so I think there's a kind of like plasticity, there's a little bit of more like object quality to this piece that kind of comes a little bit from Clayton. He also, in addition to being an engineer, has a background in sculpture, just like Tom, in addition to being an architect, has a background in sculpture. So I think that the way in which he helps push our work forward is some of the ways in which the structure kind of acts like a drawing. Like there's, in the hide and seek piece, for instance, like that long runway space in the main courtyard, that's a column-free, like 90-foot span, because all of the lateral forces are kind of taken out by the moment frames that support the flexing mirrors, and then other elements of it are kind of hung from the truss. So I think we work really closely with him to kind of push that sort of ambiguity of how we can get these really, really thin, long members that have a kind of elegance to them. They also sort of appear like drawings in space, like lines. So I think you can see a little bit of that also in this piece with the kind of lattice structure and the sort of thinness of these ramping platforms. So I think he really helps to push the kind of articulation that there's a kind of thinness, there's a lightness to the work. So I hope that answers your question. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really vibrant. Mm-hmm. This was a structural feat too. But it's a much smaller space. It's only 2,500 square feet. So yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that was the sort of direct provocation that we had from the gallery. They were like, okay, we're going to give you this commission, but it's really about moving your practice forward. And like, given this opportunity, what would you do with it? And so, yeah, I think that in this work, there's a kind of lushness that maybe wasn't evident in some of the, at least in the two projects that I showed today. Um, this blue is something that I'm still figuring out. I mean, like we were really intentional in, because this material actually comes in like 6 different colors, right? It comes in black and tan and red and orange, yellow, green, purple. Um, and there was something about the associations with this blue that were, that just became really impactful. I think because of its other sort of usages, not only in art, like you mentioned, but in film, especially. Sorry, I'm losing sight of what the original question was, which is like, how is this moving our work in a new direction? Yeah, I mean, I think that I'm really interested actually in doing some kind of smaller scale explorations with this and continuing with this material. So whether there are a series of like kind of relief like drawings or smaller constructions, but just something that kind of investigates this as a material a little bit further. Um, I think there are ways in which you'll probably see this come up again for us, because I think it was really a kind of productive experiment to a certain extent. Like we never worked with this material before. I will say that it kind of continues some of our interests and explorations from hide and seek, in the sense of like using a material or a screen as a kind of veil and as a sort of filter that you see other figures and colors through or beyond, right? So the canopy at hide and seek, in the competition, they asked us, well, why is everything black? Why does it have to be black? And we were like, well, when you look through a black screen, you actually see the vibrancy of the blue beyond, the blue sky beyond. You see the red brick of the PS1 building. You see all of these other colors like through this black mesh. And so, I'm interested in how this blue acts as another kind of veil or ghosting layer that sort of blurs out the figures beyond it. So I think we're going to keep experimenting with it. I don't necessarily have another project lined up like where I'm directly going to use this, but I think in sort of smaller explorations, I'm really interested in how it sometimes moves between being very opaque, depending on the lighting and the angle at which you look at it, and then other moments it actually has a kind of like translucence. so there's a number of things that I'm still like kind of interested in exploring about it. Oh. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I only showed that one video, which was from Klaus's Instagram, but I think, I mean, we'll see what happens with this one because it's only been up for a couple of weeks. But you know, I am interested in, even though, like, we're kind of like committed to these very like analog things and like not that great at social media and all those sorts of things, but we do make these experiences for people to go into, right? And I think it's really important that the work is accessible, that it, you know, seeing a kid run through here is like amazing, right? They just kind of zip through there with a kind of abandon. And sort of that the audience that isn't like art centric or architecture focused, I'm really interested in learning about what they do when they come here, because they don't need to hear the lecture, they just go and they experience it. And so Instagram and Facebook and those sorts of things becomes another way for us to mine what our own work is doing. So certainly in the case of PS1, where it is a very like highly photographed, like, you know, there's just so many people that go there every week, it became this really compelling window onto the project that continued to like teach us about what we had done after we had done it. So, you know, we're not looking at it in some way of like, how many likes did somebody like put up about our project? But it's a, you know, like what photograph did they take? Where did they pause? What did, you know, also I really enjoy when I'm in Seattle, like the mezzanine is actually the office for the gallery director. And so I can look down from this window in the office and see how people are moving on the street. And, you know, it's very interesting. Like people will kind of, you know, be walking, like doing their everyday thing, maybe on their phone. And then there's this moment where they kind of slow and they turn their head, and sometimes they poke their head in and they say like, oh, can I come in here? Or, you know, one time there was a whole like classroom of children that were literally like right at the threshold, like giggling, you know, what can we go in here? So, you know, I think we continually learn from that, and it impacts the next thing that we do. Like we certainly learn from what people did at the Longing piece, which changed how we did things at Hide and Seek, which then changed how we did things here. So, you know, we're not approaching that with any kind of like scientific accuracy, and I, I think part of the lure and trap of this piece is, you know, Amazon is in the middle of developing this facial recognition software that really like tracks people and like starts to kind of militarize like public space. And so we did think about like, what if we could put some sort of like scrambler in the gallery so that like you can't be tracked when you actually go into this space, or but maybe that's a little bit outside of my area of expertise. So, here's a student. Yeah. So you're saying if I went from like a more bounded space to more of a field condition? I mean, I think every site has its constraints, right? Like whether they're, physical walls and kind of hard-edged boundaries, or they're certain like zoning and policy decisions, or they're, the particularities of like the audience and the people who will come and use that place. Like, I think we really try and bring a lot of those sort of externalities like into our awareness on the project, so that we're kind of responding to all of those constraints in the thing that we're making. So it's a good question. Like, how would our work be different in a kind of open field condition? It's not one that I've ever been asked or thought about. I think, if I were presented with the opportunity, in a way, it's like I kind of search for and find those edges for myself in the project, right? It's like you have to have something to react against, or to respond to. So I think even I don't really believe in the like kind of tabula rasa, as though there's like a kind of blankness of sight, or even the preciousness of like a white-walled gallery or something like that. Like, it always has a context, it has a history. People bring their own histories of movement and how they engage with that type of space, right? So, for instance, this gallery, we had one person who walked by, and he's like, "Oh, you know what? I've been working in this area for 7 years, and it took me like 5 of those 7 years to realize that this was actually a space that was for me, that I could go into." So, even when, they have signs outside and they open the doors and there is this kind of like clear sort of gesture to someone to engage with a place in a particular way, like there are all these other kinds of restrictions that might be put in place that are less spoken. So I think, any site is going to have particular conditions that you have to respond to. Go ahead. Yeah, thanks. Mm-hmm. 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 I'm not sure either. Well, I could talk a little bit about the Midwest. And I mean, I think, like, I grew up in Minnesota. I say it's where I'm from, even though I was like born on the East Coast and went to school on the East Coast. And but 5th grade to 12th grade, I lived in Minnesota. And I do think, I guess to kind of go back to your question, there is something about the like vast like flatness of that prairie landscape that I think is really intriguing. There's a kind of like boundlessness, monotony, some might describe it. I think that our work is about this kind of like gathering and this like knotting together. Like, I think that's really evident in the last piece. It's interesting that you see it as a kind of escape. But you have these like 4 tendrils that actually enter into that space, and then they kind of get knotted in the back near the skylights. Whereas this one was much more like a found object. Again, we're really bad at social media. We didn't really like tell people that this thing was there. People just sort of happened upon it and found it, and then we would hear these stories afterwards of like, hey, my friends and I, we went there and we got super high and we like shot lasers back and forth in between the mirrors, whatever it was. So I think they each of the pieces have their own kind of gravity to them. They have their own like sense of attraction, right? So this is maybe more like a found object, but it kind of started to live in this mythic like word of mouth kind of thing where as stories about it were passed through different communities, then people would actually kind of like gravitate and go there. Whereas the blue lure piece is much more about like in the city, in this like space of such velocity where people are like, these tech workers who are just like A to B. How do we break them from that cycle to a certain extent? So they each have their gravitational pulls, but they're sort of doing it in different ways. I don't know if that actually answered your question either. Yeah, you're talking about like this kind of tongue that comes down. Yeah, that actually like completes one of the loops. So, I mean, this piece is kind of interesting because you can look at it from outside of it, right? Like you can be in it and in this sort of like looping blue environment, but you can also be in the gallery just sort of like appreciating it as an object. In a way, it's like the most object-like thing that we've ever made. So yeah, I mean, I think in our experience of watching people maneuver and move around it, there's a lot of uncertainty of like when they actually engage with it, because actually all of the walls are kind of canted. It's sort of like Dr. Caligari, like everything is sort of off kilter, including the floor. So you actually have to walk through the space with a kind of slowness and deliberateness. You can't just, unless you're a kid and you don't have any like fear about falling, you have to walk through it with a kind of thoughtfulness. And so I do think there's movement through that sequence, and then there's a kind of release of like when you're just standing outside of it on level ground and looking at it. So people kind of move back and forth between both. Oh, and about your question about prairie landscape, I don't know why I'm like forgetting about this total other project that I did show an image of. So even here, this project is in the middle of a sculpture park in Minnesota. So ostensibly like a kind of flat, open ground. And I don't have other images of this project in this presentation, but that landscape is very much like set up by a certain patterning of the Jeffersonian grid. Like there's a kind of like legibility of gridded space that exists there. And so this kind of insertion of these elements was about introducing a kind of oblique or diagonal or other sort of movement within that pattern. So we can talk more about that after Q&A being over. But yeah, good. That's a good question. Yeah, on the one hand, there's a kind of, it's like sort of painful, like when they come down. Like this one is actually still up, so that's like one you can go and see if you ever happen to be in rural Minnesota. I think the time is like a funny thing. Like PS1 was up for a short amount of time, but a ton of people saw it. This project was only up for one night. but there were like 45,000 people who went to this event where this piece was exhibited. So there's a kind of like strange dilation that can happen. Whereas, this piece was like in a gallery. I have no idea how many people saw that. Probably like 10. I don't know how that changes the interpretation of the work. I mean, the temporariness, I think, is something that gives them a kind of like, yeah, there's a certain urgency of trying to go and see it if you know about it. But that also is something that I don't really have control over, like people's desires to see the work or, yeah, I don't know how it'll change if we actually ever get like something that's permanent. Like if we would then take on a different set of concerns because the thing will be more lasting, right? Like even the choice of materials of what we used to make this was based on the fact that it was only up for, 2.5 months. So this is actually aluminized mylar, so it's got a like pudginess. It's like a silver pillow, and then it has these like inflatables inside of it and steam coming out of the top of it, and so it's actually this like really soft tower, which I don't think we would do if it was meant to stay there for 25 years, right? So it does drive a certain like kind of material consideration in terms of like its longevity, especially when you're doing something that's outside. But I don't know about the audience experience. Like if there is this kind of like built up sense of urgency about it, I think I'm less in control of that. Go ahead.
I have so many questions because several questions that provokable questions. First of all, I did want to mention that there is a famous work by arcade photographer called Time to Play, which was exhibited in the U.S. Pavilion and it has a section called Time to See. So there's so many parallels that we're doing with film, and even just the nature of the last question about the temporality of it. And I also heard parallels when they talk about Instagram. Some of these installations are perfect for theory because they are Instagram moments. I actually wanted to comment that I feel like there's a real great opportunity to explore the relationship of these sort of tactile material interfaces between people's temporality and film, and the fact that there are parallels between architecture being projected to a flat screen to give a sense of illusion of depth of space, and the opposite. So an opportunity for you to explore where you can actually start to bring the film, interact with people on a level of what is real and what's not. You're starting, it's really, really exciting to me. So I'm excited. I am curious how it's going to change because I'm doing something permanent. Because there's an element of that in the work which makes it precious. And then perhaps, like right now you're using film to document, but maybe there's more that can be done, especially when you're working with someone just to talk about these possible things.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Isaac is someone who, he's local, he's in Minnesota. He's also in this really amazing band called Marijuana Death Squads, anyway. But he's a very interesting guy. But yeah, I mean, I think that that's certainly an interest, is like, how can we push that part of the practice? It was interesting when we were trying to design our website. We were trying to find a web designer who really thought about like the interface of like the flatness of the computer screen and like these, windows and the way you can kind of continually click into like these other worlds in the sort of web interface. We didn't quite get there with the designer we were trying to work with, but I think there is always this kind of like questioning of media, right? Like, what does it allow us to do? Tom, if he were here, he would probably talk about an early series of sculptures that he did that were using polyester resin, like so the same things that a film negative is made out of, to kind of capture space. So he would make these castings of like dead end highways out of resin, and then mount them in a gallery space. So it became, again, another kind of like overlap and intersection with architecture, film, and the specifics of materiality. So it's in there. Uh, we just have to figure out how to like get some bigger commissions so we're not exhausted from just like making this. But yeah. So thank you. Yeah. Cheers.